briefly introduce myself. So I am a self-taught software engineer, which is a bit odd because actually I never went to university and never learned how all these primitives worked from going all the way from the beginning in math to the cryptography. I actually only so that when I started working in the cryptocurrency space, I had to really think about these primitives, how they work, and more about what they allow you to do. And so actually, I think I sort of started approaching this backwards, and which is, I think, a bit of a maybe a positive thing, or a perspective I can show you is that actually, of course, it's great to be able to understand why a hash function is secure, and we could spend a few hours on that, nerding out about how they work and what it does, but that I think would not be very helpful, because then we're just talking about one primitive, and I think in day-to-day, unless you are a cryptographer, there's this golden rule called never roll your own crypto, if you can avoid it at all costs. You shouldn't actually be designing your own primitives, you should just be using them. So we'll talk a little bit about it. I've heard that you've mentioned hash functions. I think these are probably the most basic primitive that we use and that are used in so many different places, but then it goes into signature schemes, encryption schemes, key exchange, zero knowledge proofs, and all kinds of different variations of signature schemes. And a Merkle tree is more of a not really considered a primitive anymore. A key exchange is not really a primitive either. That would be considered more of a protocol. But those are the building blocks, and I'll try to explain some of them. But before that, I think why do we even talk about them in the peer-to-peer space when in most other industries those cryptographic primitives don't matter that much? And I think so. To explain why, I want to list maybe a few peer-to-peer projects that are not, or decentralized web projects that are not really relying on cryptographic primitives. I think that, so off the top of my head, and I think it would be interesting to research more into them, but projects that don't rely on these are, is for example the SETI project. If anyone's familiar with SETI at home, or folding at home, it's this research projects where people said, or where researchers said, people have all these unused computing resources, and there's a huge amount of data coming in through our sensors that measure incoming signals, electromagnetic signals coming from space, but we have no way to process and to look for patterns of extraterrestrial information. So SETI was this project basically where people could run a node locally that would say, hey, I have this capacity, I can process some signals, and then if they find results, they post them, and basically what they do is they just summarize data and then would report back to the research server, sort of if anything was found that would need to look into more closely. And so SETI doesn't kind of rely on these with SETI, the challenge is, well, you don't really know if the node is doing the actual work, or if they're just saying, oh, nothing found, and then there's then saying, okay, I've done the work, right? But the thing with this project in particular is, well, it's volunteer work. No one's forced to do it. No one's incentivized to do it. And if the work was done wrongly, worst case would be anyway, if they wouldn't do the work, no one else would do the work. So those signals would just get would remain unprocessed. So the downside is not really there. So the SETI project doesn't need to protect itself from downsides, right? A different peer-to-peer technology that doesn't use a lot of cryptographic primitives is actually email in its first form. email was not using any sort of encryption, was not using any sort of authentication, right? Any email address, you can send any kind of email. And you sort of see the problems that we have is like we have to build these super complicated spam filters because people are just saying, oh, like I don't pay anything for email, I can like change my IP address and send new email, and like the old IP address can be blacklisted, but like that doesn't affect my new IP address. So like there's all of these challenges, right? And so all of this happens in the clear. And so I think it's a very primitive protocol. That email was actually invented before there was encryption on computers. So actually at that point in time, everything was done unencrypted. And it's not just encryption, it's also authentication. Because if you don't have encryption, if you don't have the basic primitives for encryption, you also don't have authentication. So of course, but what I mean by that is not I can give you a password and the username, but there's actually a way that I can verify some sort of cryptographic authentication with a private and public key that is useful for computers, because passwords and usernames, they can be replicated and lost and changed and so on. So those are like, I think, two examples of peer-to-peer protocols that don't use a lot of cryptographic primitives. But now let's talk about peer-to-peer protocols and why they do need cryptographic primitives. I think BitTorrent is an interesting one because they're mainly the cryptographic primitives used there, meaning like they rely on hash functions to sort of create checksums and distribute different chunks of data and sort of communicate about them. I think this is still not something that has an incentive model or some sort of way of keeping score. And actually, a lot of this delivery of data is done voluntarily. So if you run a node, you just deliver data, and if you don't, then that's fine. And sort of these trackers keep track of how much you're delivering, but really the tracker is sort of the centralized entity that would take would sort of measure it and go through it. And so, but BitTorrent already uses some, and then like if you move, like you go into like other protocols, of course, like in blockchain, like it's like everything needs to be enforced cryptographically, because there's like any kind of like violation of the rules would need to be immediately noticeable and would need to be verifiable. You need to basically, so it needs to be, everyone needs to universally agree these are the rules, and if they're not followed, then that person acting badly should not be able to act this way. And so they are like, we use all of these things, right? With BitTorrent, whereas with BitTorrent I share a file, and if I don't want to share it anymore, I just turn my node off. That's a different kind of problem than trying to solve. I have some money in an account, but my account is actually not on my computer, but every computer has this account, and we need to make sure that only I can spend the money that everyone knows I have in my account. So sort of why cryptographic primitives is there's many applications like that. And so what I would think sort of for the outline of today, I want to start very simple with hash functions. And then I go into one application, which are Merkle trees. Then signature schemes. And specifically, so like why this asymmetry of it. Then we can go look at encryption. Maybe if it's of interest and we have time, we can look at Diffie-Hellman key exchange, which is about so Diffie-Hellman key exchange is about how two nodes that don't know each other can establish a shared secret so that they can talk secretly without having to ever exchange something that if that component was, so if someone reads your, if someone reads all of your communication between two parties, that third party couldn't figure out at the end what those people spoke about without those two nodes ever knowing each other. So that's like basically Diffie-Hellman key exchange. And then we can go into things like threshold signatures, which so we'll talk more about them, but I think we won't have time to go into all of them, so I'm listing them, and we can then, like, as we work our way down the list, we have to like prioritize and pick. So threshold signatures, and then also one thing that's very fancy, very hyped right now, are zero knowledge proofs. But talk about hash functions. In the most simplest way, you have a hash function is defined that hash of input A always gives B, and you can have, and basically, so the first function is that it compresses. So you can have an arbitrary length A, an arbitrary length constant A, and you will always end up with some like constant size B. Usually it's 256 bit hash. So you can take like you can take an entire book, you can create a hash of it, and you'll get a unique 256 bit hash. And by unique, I mean, of course, you can have collisions. So collisions, but we'll get into detail later. So this is like the most basic thing. Like you give it something long, you get something short. But there, of course, like you could always just say, oh, I'm taking the 5 first characters of this long book, and then I'll have something shorter. But that doesn't work in many different areas, because what you typically want in a hash function is you want collision resistance, which means that you want to make sure that you don't have that for any kind of input you basically have a seemingly random output, so that you basically would let me think about it. So first thing is this let's talk about pseudorandomness first. One attribute of a hash function, and not all hash functions have all of these attributes, and that's where then you really have to get into into the details of these different hash functions. They behave depending on which ones. Like some are suitable for one application but not for the other. But so pseudorandomness is basically for any A, it's very hard for me to guess B. So if A was 5 and if A was 5 and the result of this function B was 10, then I shouldn't be able to know, oh, I know that A is, if I put in 5, I get 10, and if I put in 6, I get 11. That would be bad, because if we need some sort of randomness, which is something that's, basically computers can't do randomness. There's nothing in computers, like if you start a computer, everything would be it behaves exactly the same way, right, every time you start it. So they actually, a challenge in cryptography in many cases is randomness. How do you generate randomness? Computers take like the temperature, the date, or sort of sometimes you use like mouse movement or any kind of external information, because if you would just start a program with the exact same input, it's deterministic, right? So randomness is one thing, and so what you want with the hash functions a lot of times, you want randomness so that you don't have this problem that people can predict what the output of a hash is. The other function you want is a one-way function. So given B, it should be extremely hard to find A. So why would one want to have a one-way function? For example, I can say, I can tell you, I have this book with hash b, and then you know that I really have that book with hash b. I can't like come up with some other a that would give you a b, that will give you the given b. So, for example, this is when I commit to a when we just agree on like a file in DAT or in IPFS, you create a hash of it to make sure that if I give you a file that has this hash, we actually agreed on this file, because if I can find a collision, so I can easily take B and say, oh, I need to make up a file that will result in this. I can make up an A that will result in the same B. Then I can break that hash function. So then that hash function is not that valuable anymore for guaranteeing that the input of the hash really was that.
Okay, I have two questions.
Yeah.
So, one, when we're talking about a hash function that's
256 bits.
56 bits. It doesn't hold the content. I'll ask both questions and then you can eat a little bit more. Okay, so
yeah.
The first one is then it doesn't actually hold any more than 256 bits of data. It can be pointing to a far larger file. It's pointing to it. It's not really holding the data beyond pointing to it. Okay, that was my first question. Keep shooting. And then the second question is, when you're talking about pseudorandomness, like, is it, like, it sounds like you're sort of talking about uniqueness, like, and it's randomness, but it's also, it seems like randomness is also a facet of uniqueness in the sense that, like, there might be another, there might be another randomly generated number that's even, okay, no wait, it's not uniqueness. So basically you're saying that you can technically generate two random numbers that point to the same object, and that's collision. Like if you had two random numbers, but they both point to B, that's collision.
Okay, so I think a few, so I'll show a few examples and give you like made up hash functions that satisfy one requirement but don't satisfy the other requirement, and how that can be abused. Basically so pseudo-randomness, you need, if you need randomness. So for example, we can say, so when you need a random string, for example, to do a coin toss, if we do a coin toss in a trustless way, if we have two programs or two computers and we need to decide if it's heads or tails, to both then decide who gets paid out the lottery, then my computer can say it's heads and your computer can say it's heads, and we just both say, oh, we randomly determined that it's head, or we won, or you won, or I won.
We both won the lottery.
Yeah, that doesn't work.
That's collision.
So pseudo-randomness needs to basically says that for like, you have like this random distribution overall. So like if you have like for any input, right, you have like a uniform distribution. It's not like your hash function shouldn't look something like this, where you say, oh, like for large, so this is in and this is out, right? Like if your distribution was like this, and then you would know, actually, if my input is like, and this is 200, so then I know, oh, if my input is below 100, it's very likely that my output is also low. And then if my input was between 100 and 200, like it's somewhere in the middle, it's probably going to be, if this is the probability of the output, it's probably going to be high, and then it's going to be low again. Then I can actually, then it's unfair anymore, because then I can sort of predict it, right? So this is like the pseudo-randomness. Basically, for any input, you cannot predict if the output is going to be low or high. So like no matter how you change the input, so you want to have the same distribution. And so, for example, with a coin toss, that would be important if we said, oh, we're gonna take the newspaper headline of tomorrow's newspaper. If we both agree, tomorrow we're gonna go to NewYorkTimes.com and take the headline and hash it. And if the hash is odd, then I win, and if the hash is even, then you win. So now we outsource our pseudorandomness to something that isn't very hard to predict, because we don't know what the headline is going to be, and we just need this oracle that basically we have this input, and the output is going to determine whether it's heads or tails. If we would go and say, oh, depending on what the headline is, you win or I win, then I would say, oh, if the headline starts with a T or an E, I win, and if it starts with an X, you win. That would not be fair, right? So for that kind of, you can use pseudorandomness. So for the coin toss, this is helpful, and this is also needed if you need to come up with encryption keys and things like that. We'll see later. The one-way function is different. For example, a few years ago, there was a very weak hash function was broken, and someone said, I have this hash x that says who's going to win the presidential election. I think it was Obama and what's this old guy's name, McCain? Sorry. And I think it was, I might mix up the election that it was about, but it was a few years ago. So basically, those researchers said, we have this hash, and we already know who the president is. It's the hash. The hash actually points to a PDF file where the name of the president is in, right? And so they have file 1 that says Obama, and file 2 that says McCain, and both somehow create this hash X, right? And they do that by doing Obama plus some garbage text. And so this hash function is weak, meaning it can be exploited because the computation behind it is easy to do, or they discovered flaws in those kind of hash functions, that they can predict that what this needs to be without spending an insane amount of computing effort to be able to create two files that create the two hashes. So this is actually if a hash function can be exploited like that, right? A lot of things break. So for example, with IPFS needs to use a collision-resistant hash function, because if I tell you I give you file 1 or a file with hash X, and that in any file storage protocol, decentralized file storage protocol, if I give you hash X, then I need to know that actually no, you cannot just give me this file or this file, and you have and both of them are going to be. I'm going to think, oh, this is the file I actually wanted. So one-way function is important that I can't take, because otherwise I could basically say, oh, I have this file Obama, this gives me X, therefore let me reverse that calculation and let me find a file where, knowing X, I can put in McCain plus something else. And that's the one-way function property.
One-way function is a stronger form of encryption because you can't do it the other way.
So it's more of it's basically the one-way function is that it means that this hash function is a one-way function because it's computationally very easy to do this way. It takes fractions of a second to calculate. But if you give a computer B and tell them find me A, that's I don't know how. So that's the one-way function, right? And then collision resistance actually is sort of a function that comes with the one-way function, so basically what you're saying is I cannot choose A and B randomly such that they both create X, and which is so there's a nuance to this. Basically, for example, if a hash function would always give you an odd, if you could pick, if you can pick your pre-image A and your pre-image B, or if you can pick a arbitrary pre-image B for any A to create a collision, then that would still be an issue in some instances. Not in the McCain example. In the McCain example, you actually need a, this is then called chosen message collision, where the chosen message is basically, it needs to say McCain, right? I can break a blockchain already if I have an arbitrary pre-image attack. So my blockchain says, this is the ledger of transaction, and ledger of transaction is A, and if I can just provide some garbage that also satisfies this hash function, then it will already break. Whereas in the McCain example, if it didn't contain McCain, then they couldn't publish that alternative version.
Because Obama won.
Yeah.
Right, I get it.
Yeah, so Obama, yes, you're right. So this is sort of, there's the collision resistance can be both just a, I can find a second pre-image that contains, that breaks the hash function, or I can do a chosen pre-image, meaning I can have some sort of structure in this pre-image, and the pre-image is A is the pre-image. So pre-image, that's what you call A. So the pre-image needs to have some sort of structure, right? It needs to say McCain or Obama. So that's hash functions. There are many different ones, and it becomes quite complex because they have all sorts of various different optimizations. For example, in zero-knowledge proofs, certain hash functions are extremely hard to use because they're very computationally expensive, whereas others are much cheaper. There are some that are already known to be broken soon, others are known to be much more secure. Then you have, yeah.
Is the zero-knowledge proof a hash function?
No, this is a protocol that we'll talk about later. But I'm just saying, so they're like SHA-256 is what's used in Ethereum everywhere. Alright, SHA-256 and Kekak. But then, for example, Polkadot uses Blake2B. They're like Zcash and their version they use Blake2B and Peterson hashes. So there's just like you probably have a few dozen hash functions you can use, and sort of understanding what these different trade-offs are is important for picking the hash function. But in general, like the sort of the defaults that you use, unless you go into really exotic stuff, are like Blake2B or Kekak on Ethereum. Like those two are fairly fast and known to be secure according to today's like computers. Completely different. Like all of the primitives we'll talk about now are not quantum, or not all of them are quantum secure. And so when quantum computers come around, a lot of the fundamental math that a lot of this relies on is actually going to be broken, and then and experts are debating whether that's going to be in 10 years, in 20 years, or in 30 years, and so this will like change the way the internet works quite drastically.
Well, change kind of everything.
Yeah.
So,
Cool. So are there questions about? So let's do a few examples of hash functions. I've mentioned. One is, content addressed storage. So if you have a file and you need to both refer to it or you need to retrieve it, what's to be guaranteed that you get a given file if you refer to it by the hash, it's the counterparty will have a very hard time to give you a file that is any different than what the file really is because of these properties, right? Another one is actually, I think, a super simple one that can show you one application is a blind auction. So in a blind auction, what you want to do is you don't want to reveal what your bid is until everyone has put in a bid, because you don't actually want to have everyone puts in a higher bid, or you don't want to put the bid out in the public, because like to have like, for example, to play a game of rock paper scissors. Again, if two computers are talking to each other, they're not going to do like this, because computers are fast enough to like immediately a computer's going to be able to say, oh, I'm going to wait like a nanosecond more to get the response first from the other party, and then I'm going to change my response so that I can always win, right? Again, it's like a problem of timing. You cannot make sure that computers like both communicate their response at the same time.
I'm asking a lot of questions. I hope other people ask questions. If don't let me be the only one interrupting, or tell me not to, because I can always ask you some other times. But I'm curious, like, so you're now naming a couple of things. So you've named a few things, and you've named like the SHA 5, the SHA
256,
256, and the key
Kekak.
Kekak.
K, I don't even like it's.
So those are two commonly used hash functions you said in Ethereum, and now you're talking about some other things that you're relating to hash functions, like blind auctions and.
So those are applications now. So
and they're applications
where hash functions are used.
Where hash functions are used.
So like if I write a program that that should say give me the latest movie, or give me this movie called Titanic. How do I make sure I get the movie called Titanic?
Right.
I actually don't tell the computer give me and write out Titanic, because your Titanic might be different than mine. I tell you give me the file with this hash.
Now I get it.
And then I get the right movie.
My bad.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And so we can also do blind auctions or rock, paper, scissors, both essentially the same problem, right? So you have this problem that two computers need to communicate if it's rock, paper, or scissors, but we actually we don't want to just send that in the clear, because then whoever gets the message first can wait and send the message after they've received your opponent's choice. So how can you actually do that? What would be, does anyone want to attempt to propose how you can solve this problem of having a fair rock, paper, scissors without?
I have one, but it will take a really long time, I think. So
Okay.
we will use this one hash function, and then we'll keep waiting till the quantum computers work, and then we'll figure out the other way around.
Oh, that's how we would break it first.
Right.
Yes, but so what, I think that maybe this was too simple of a question, but so what you can do, right, is you can say, I do hash of rock and I get B, and I send that to you, and then you do hash of scissors and you send that to me, and then we say, okay, now we've exchanged our turns, and now we're going to reveal. And now I'm going to say, hey, look, actually, if you do hash of rock, you'll get my hash, and then you tell me, actually, my response was scissors, and I'll see, oh yeah, actually, you gave me hash of scissors, and it matches. Then I know you haven't changed your message since I've given you my answer, right? So basically, you have Alice and Bob. Alice says. Alice sends hash of rock, and then B sends, and Bob sends hash of scissors. Right, so let's just call this beta and alpha, and now both know, okay, Alice has Bob's answer, it's beta, and Bob has Alice's answer, it's alpha. And now you do the second step. The second step, Alice says, actually, it was rock. And what Bob does hash of rock and sees, oh, this is alpha, so this is correct. Alice didn't change her response because she said, and this is a commitment scheme, she committed to alpha, and then revealed the commitment by sending rock. And so now I know, oh, actually, yeah, Alice said it would be alpha, and I checked hash of rock is alpha, so that's fine. And then same thing, right? Bob says, actually, my turn was scissors. Alice does the same thing. she computes hash of scissors and checks this is the data that I got, therefore Alice knows that Bob didn't change their answer, right? So like this is how you can do in a two, like you break up this step into two steps where like now both know actually they haven't changed their answer. But of course, like if you look at this game actually, it's very easy actually with, you have like, so now we can talk about a common exploitive hash functions, which are called rainbow tables. If Bob was evil, it's called Bob Eve. If Bob was Eve, and so this is cryptographers always have Alice and Bob and Charlie, or like just random people. Eve is evil, so E is usually the attacker. So if Eve is evil, actually all she needs to do is she creates this table where she does, oh, rock, like hash of rock is 1, hash of paper is 2, and hash of scissors is 3, and these are different results, right? Then it's actually very easy, because there are only 3 inputs, it's very easy to compute this table.
Yeah.
And say, oh, actually, alpha here is 1, so oh, Alice is picking rock. So like now what we introduce is, we introduce this thing called a salt. So a salt is, let's change this protocol. Salt is basically something you pick, and then you randomly, or anything you do to add, to make this harder, because now Alice can pick this salt randomly, so it's just something that's added to the hash. And now Bob doesn't know if it's rock plus 1, rock plus 2, rock plus 3, rock plus 155,000. And so now Alice would, if Bob or Eve, would have to create a rainbow table where it was like rock plus a random number that Alice picked. And it could be all potential random numbers. And so now instead of having 3 possible values, you have almost infinite possible values. And so what you do is, same thing, right? Rock plus salt. Now it's not in this rainbow table anymore. And here you would also add a salt. And actually now, all we need to do is we need to agree that actually Alice also sends salt to Eve, and Eve would need to send like the salt of Eve, and this is the salt of Alice. And now we've solved this problem, right? The rainbow table doesn't apply anymore. And still, like, you might wonder, oh, but then actually, if Alice can pick any salt, well, she could like pick a salt and then like try to make up try to find a hash where it would be like, so like, let's assume like salt is 1. Maybe she could also find paper plus 2 would result in the same thing, right? And that would be the chosen preimage attack. So actually, because this is hard to do, because given a hash A, she cannot find this structured message. Actually, even so there's this like random thing in here. As long as you know that this is the structure, like you can always verify it. As long as you have the salt, you know, like this is what's committed to. So like this salt here looks like, oh, like now the preimage has changed, and like it's something that you might not be able to verify anymore. Actually, from a security perspective, this doesn't matter, right? It's just something that additional data I have to give.
So back to your Obama-McCain example then.
Mm-hmm.
So the ability to have guessed, like whether it was to try to change either rock or scissor to get the same alpha, that would speak to the quality of the hash function being poor. Okay.
Exactly, yeah. So they picked a weak hash function. I think, if I remember correctly, it's SHA-1, not SHA-256. And that could also be, oh no, I think it might be MD5. So, like hash functions are continuously being improved and then being broken, and there's like a lifetime of how long these hash functions are valid, just because the computers become faster. Smart people find other exploits that don't necessarily need computing power. And so like that was actually, it was broken in this chosen pre-image. It had a chosen pre-image attack. Random just second pre-image, right? It's fairly easy to find. Okay, fairly easy is still relative in computing terms, but so if you look at 256-bit, right? This is your word. That means that 2 to the 256 possible results. You have 2 to the 256 possible results. So of course, if you try out, if you have 202 to the 256 plus 1 files that you need to hash, you will be guaranteed to have at least one collision, right? Because of course you cannot fit 2 to the 256 plus 1 into 2 to the 256 slots. So like if you think about it in very simple terms, you can have a hash function that has 3 bits output, has three different results. Like the hash function returns 1, 2, or 3, and you have like a very long like list of inputs. Like, okay, you put the first one here, you put the second one here, you put the third one here, you're good. But then what do you do with the fourth one? Well, obviously it needs to go into one, right? So like hash functions are not always unique. Like they have these pseudorandomness. They are collision resistant, meaning it's hard to get these collisions. And 2 to the 256 is an insanely high number. Like your brain cannot compute. Your brain cannot compute how big this number is. So it looks small, right? 256 bits, 256 zeros and ones doesn't look like much. It's 32 characters, a written word of 32 characters, in a computer, including all of the special characters. Like it's maybe a little bit more if you just had Latin numbers, but like it's pretty big, right? But still, like it's just a probability that, and of course, like it's actually much fewer. You will have a collision earlier because of course, like unless you would pick like exactly the right one so that you would fill only one slot once, but so this is a probability. And how did we get to this?
So, quick question.
Yeah.
Pragmatically, what happens if there's a collision, or we only talk about it to say we don't want this to happen?
So we don't want this to happen. You can just use brute force compute to try to find one. That has not happened, I think, with any of the secure hash functions because they take enough computation time, or there are no ways that you can like manipulate choosing certain inputs that you know are more likely to result in a collision, right?
Yeah.
So that's like this when I show this curve of saying like if a hash function looked like this, or if the input is in this range, it's very likely to be low, and the output is in this range, it's very likely to be high. Then you can say, oh, we're just gonna take this range, or even different. Like if you know, oh, if your output is divisible by 3, it's likely to be in this area. Then you would, to exploit this hash function, you would like know you can reduce the complexity of finding a collision significantly because you can just try multiples of 3, right? And then you would like look in this narrower space for collisions. And hash functions have been broken by looking in that space, not by arbitrarily trying random inputs and then trying to find a collision. Because the chance of finding a collision just by trying random inputs and saying, oh, like maybe I hit a collision, that's called the birthday problem. So what I talked about the slots here, that's called the I think pigeonhole problem. So meaning if you have 3 pigeonholes and you have 4 pigeons, 1 pigeon needs to go into a pigeonhole where there is already a pigeon. So pigeonhole problem is this, right? You cannot have 4 pigeons and 3 pigeonholes. The birthday attack is if you, or the birthday problem is if you if you have 356 days in a year, what is the chance of likelihood that two people in a room have the same birthday? If we're two people, it's like, and so now I could pull it up if it's interesting, but like, so if, like, right, if it's two people, it's fairly small. It's like 1 to the 1 divided by 365 times 1, right? So like we pick random slots of one slot of 365 slots. The chance that we randomly pick the same slot is fairly low, but the more you add more people, like the bigger the room becomes, the higher the chances of a collision. And so when you do that with 256-bit values and not just 1 year with 365 days, then actually for all the people in the world, or all of the possible phones, like any kind of order, like you can look at it, those like the chance of having a collision is so extremely low that even if you took every single file that existed on a computer today, like the chance of like you having two files that both have the same hash are basically zero. So like it won't happen, or it's something that like it's worth like not caring about. So like this is like a probability. A hash function is not guaranteed, it's just a probability, but this probability with everything in cryptography, it's always a probability, but that probability is just low enough, or that it happens.
Can I ask another quick question? Because as you were explaining the rock thing, you use terms like, you started to use like a commitment scheme that is like, is it, so I was just wondering whether, is it like the same as those commit and reveal voting like schemes in like blockchain type?
Yeah, so in blockchain this is like commit and reveal. This is the commit phase and this is the reveal phase.
Perfect.
So you have to be, so to do this in a trustless way, you could have a third party. You could say C and both trust C, and then C would say here rock and scissors. C says Alice wins, right, to both, and that would be like how eBay does it. Like we trust eBay and we say, and eBay says, actually, Alice won, so I'm going to tell both Eve and Alice, or Bob and Alice, that Alice won. And so now if we want to change this to trustless, then we need to go to this commit reveal scheme. I think, is everyone like kind of comfortable enough with hash functions? Do we want to go through some more examples, or do you have questions?
Are there other kinds than hash functions? Like, I think I have quite a nice idea right now about hash function. Not a professional still, but.
So there's so many more use cases, and I think I want to look into one, and it's a bit of it's a blockchain focused one, but I think still in other places very useful. So
there's base 64. What is this?
Base 64 just takes any kind of data and encodes it in a way that only uses numbers and letters. So that's more of an encoding issue. Like you have basically on a computer, you have like one byte is 8 characters, is 256 numbers, but there's only 27 letters in the alphabet and 10 numbers, 0 to 9, that you can use, that humans really can easily read. And so base 64 is just a way to encode those 256 bits into a subset that is readable to the
and you can just decode it back.
Yeah. So
okay.
it's not really
it's not
no, it's not easy. But of course, like it's one way to, like, this hash is like, you need to turn this into a human readable form, and so like you could use a base 64 encoded version of this number, or you could hex encode it, because if you would just render it as one character, then it might be a space or some weird like character that can't even be displayed because it's like some internal number. So it's just about how you would encode binary data, because this is a binary data. But okay, so we use hash functions a lot to like verify that some input has like this very concise short output, and like in blockchains it's used. So like Ethereum uses two different or like Bitcoin actually. So Bitcoin consensus algorithm, proof of work, they use hash functions. They use hash functions basically to say, so like the proof of work, simple proof of work algorithm is, right, if you have actually let's not do this in the graph. If you have any input, you have an arbitrary output. So what Bitcoin does actually, it says the proof of work is if you take the previous block, so like there's the block header, like if you take the information, if you hash the previous block, so all of the information from the last block, and then you add some sort of data to it, so like not a salt but just some randomness, then you will get another and hash that, you will get a result, like a number in this range, right? And what Bitcoin does is it says, depending on the number of computers in the network, it'll put a threshold on having to find a hash function that is smaller than a certain number. So for example, if it had to be smaller than 2 to the 128, 2 to the 255, then it would basically mean that if you have this is 2 to the 256, this is 2 to the 255, this is 2 to the 254, etc. So like if you have a hash function, you take any input, you land somewhere randomly on this line of numbers, right? This is what the output of your hash function is. So Bitcoin proof of work basically works in saying you need to find a hash that is in like this narrow gap. What does that mean? Because we cannot have, it's pseudo-random and it's a one-way function. It means that the only way for a computer to find something that is like in this narrow gap, you actually have to do a lot of computations and just randomly find it, because you cannot pick this point and say, oh, let me find the pre-image to the hash that is this, right? So because computers can't do that, Bitcoin proof of work and Ethereum's proof of work, overly simplified, what they do is they do a million hashes to find, like they do a million hashes of block plus some random number, right? They do this a million times until they find a hash that fits into like this, into this band. And all the other hash results are basically then discarded. And that's like the proof of work, because it's very easy to verify. If I tell you, look, I found this hash, and by the way, this is the input, I know that like statistically again, someone had to calculate a lot of hashes, because 99.9% of the time, or 0.99999% of the time, like they ended up, when they were trying out different random numbers, they ended up somewhere like in this part of the spectrum. And so proof of work basically uses this function, of the one-way function attribute, to very easily verify, oh yes, this person actually found this hash, this randomness that created this hash. And we know, because of how the function works, that they didn't like cheat in any way. So that's one way that hash functions are used in blockchains. But the other way that hash functions are used in blockchains is why they're called blockchains. It's because you have a chain of blocks, and they all have many transactions. So you have to verify every single one all of these single transactions, but actually which would become increasingly more complex if you have to keep track of everything and verify it again. If you basically hash all of these transactions, and now you say, okay, actually this is hash of all transactions, and then you have hash of the previous block. So if this is block 0, hash of the previous block, let's put a 0 here, and then you have like hash of all of the transactions. Then you say in block 1, you do the hash of this plus the hash of all the transactions in block 1, right? And so now you can follow you can basically follow this chain back without having to evaluate all of the transactions, and this creates this very efficient way that you don't always have to read every time you start up a new node. You have to like read all of these transactions and verify it again, because you know that if this hash is in here and this hash is in here, that like no one can manipulate all these transactions. So that's kind of the thing where I can now have this chain, right? Where if I have if I point basically this hash function, like maybe we could actually the arrows, it makes more sense to put it in different. If you have like here this hash of the previous block, and again here you have the hash of this block, then you can follow back this chain very efficiently without having to, with knowing that this stuff is not modified and doesn't change anymore. So when these blocks are basically, when you know that these blocks are the ones where this proof of work was done, you know, okay, like this is the history I can trust. So like this creates this auditability. And now and now actually I want to go a little bit into the list of transactions here. We know that hash functions, I can take arbitrary large input and give you the output. But actually, a common thing that as a user of a blockchain I want to prove is actually that I have transaction A and that it was mined in this block. And at a later point in time, I want to prove to you that this transaction was included in this block 0. Because that's how I prove to you that I have these coins or I spent these coins. Now, if there are 1,000 transactions and I want to prove to you efficiently that it was one of these, if you just take these 1,000 transactions and hash them together, and then I would have to give you these 1,000 transactions, you would calculate the hash, and then you would just look at the block headers and say, oh yeah, this is actually the hash. Then it requires me to give you the 1,000 transactions. But there's actually a way that we can avoid doing this by using a Merkle tree. Is anyone familiar with those, or have we talked about those? Okay, so cool. Merkle trees are like one of the most important parts in blockchains, because you'll see why. So we create a simple tree. We have 4 transactions in this block. One.
So Angela Merkel is also into blockchain?
No, it's actually Ralph Merkle. Is the inventor of this. But he was probably equally interesting on a political level as Angela Merkel. He was he's very much a crypto anarchist back in the day. Okay, so we have 4 transactions, and what we want to avoid is that I have to give you all 4 transactions to be able to prove to you that transaction 1 was included in this hash. By creating a Merkle tree, what we do is we say, so first of all, we hash every single leaf. This is a tree, this is a leaf, nodes, and this is the root. So we hash every single transaction, and this gives us this gives us a summarized information of this, right? So this could be like 10,000 characters, but now we have this 256-bit number for each transaction. Now what we do actually here is we hash those two together. So like if this is like H1 and this is H2, then we have actually hash of H1 plus H2. And here we have hash of H3 plus hash of H4. And here we have hash of, we call this H5, and this is H6. Now this is H5 plus H6. So now what I can do is I can give you a Merkle proof. I want to prove to you that transaction 1 is included in this Merkle root. So this is the Merkle root. I tell you, hey, transaction 1 is what I want to prove to you. I'm going to give you hash 2, and then what you do to verify is you hash transaction 1, you get a H1. I give you, so what I basically give you is I give you transaction 1, right? I give you H2. So you take transaction 1, you hash it, you get H1, you have H2 from me, now you have H5, so this gives you H5. You can compute H5 yourself. And now, I don't actually need to give you those two transactions. The only thing I need to give you to go from here to here is I need to give you H6. So actually also I need to give you H6. So you take H5 that you've computed yourself, and you take H6 that I've given to you, and now you get this. And if this is like your root that is in this block, then I can give you, instead of giving you 4 different transactions, I give you transaction 1 plus this, so you can calculate this, and then I need to give you this, so you can calculate this. And so this basically gives you logarithmic compression, right? So you have, like with 4, it's not very efficient. I still give you 3 things to prove a list of 4. But if you double it, like it's powers of 2, if it's powers of 2, right? So like now it'd be at 8, and now I'd give you 4 things for 8, or 5 things for 16, and so like that's basically, so the thing in a blockchain, the transactions, the state, everything, those are Merkle trees. And so then if I need to prove to someone that my transaction was included, I only have to give you a Merkle proof, which is much shorter than listing all of these.
The tree is this always this binary tree?
Yeah, it's a binary tree, yeah.
Yeah.
There's nothing that is, you don't need to do it. You could decide to have like 3, but actually most of the hash functions, we can go into this. Hash functions actually typically compress from 512 to 256 bits. That's usually what a hash function does. So if you have more than 512 characters, actually what you do is you take, this is your long string, you just put it in chunks, and then you take the first 2 chunks and you hash it, and then this gives you like another chunk, and you take this chunk and you take this chunk, right? So you get another block with like the first thing hashed. So depending on how you define your hash function, but basically because it's usually a 2-to-1 compression, like you will do many, these are different rounds, right? So you always take 2 and you compress it into 1, then you take the compressed one and you take the next slice and you get another one, then you take this last slice and you get it. So because of this attribute that most hash functions are good at compressing from 2 to 1, or from like, sometimes it's like 6 to, there's one hash function that is like 6 to 1, right? Mostly they're 2 to 1, but some are like 6 to 1, and there are others, but like anything you will likely to be using would be 2 to 1. So therefore a binary tree makes sense, because this needs one running the hash function once, from a computation perspective. And then there's so this is kind of the most optimized structure. And you can create all sorts of crazy things with this. For example, this is often used, like if you have a list of members of your club, and you want to have a simple way to prove a membership, then you commit to your membership club and you say, hey, like I'm member number 1, and this is the proof that I'm in this club with root R, right? So membership proofs. This is a membership proof. But you can also say, you could also look at it differently. You could say this is slot 1, this is slot 2, and this is slot 3, and this is slot 4. If you can create include a proof of non-membership. If you would say, or you could use it as a storage. So the Ethereum state actually has a Merkle tree called the state tree, and if you want to store a variable, some kind of like if you store variable 1, you store here, variable 2, you store here, variable 3, you store here, and 4 here. Then like I can ask you to give me precisely this Merkle proof. I tell you, give me Merkle proof where you prove this node and this node, and then I know you have to give me 1. So then I know what is in this slot. So like then you change it from just proving that I'm a member to proving I'm actually the first leaf in this tree. And so then if we all build the tree in the same way, then like we can give this meaning, right? If it's the first or the second or the third. So if, like, for example, you could say you always append and then you have a chronological tree. You could use depending on like sorting by the alphabet. You would build a tree if you needed a sorted tree. So those are like things you can do. But that's Merkle trees.
It's just FYI, we have about 45 minutes.
Cool. So I want to ask, we've gone like very deep into hash functions, and which is the primitive here, and then those are like the different protocols you can do. We can go like into these different at the same level of detail. We can go less detail. You can tell me if this was way too fast and I should go slower and like spend more time explaining this, or what do you think?
I would prefer if you go through them, but also there is also one thing.
Mm-hmm.
So last lecture we were zero knowledge proofs were actually discussed, and I know it's like a hype, but it would be cool if I'm pretty interested in knowing a little bit more about it.
Mm-hmm.
So like making sure to go through all of them, but maybe zeroing in on zero knowledge proofs.
Yes, zeroing off.
Any other opinions?
I'd be interested to understand threshold signature, just because it's something that I come across so often and I don't know.
Okay. Other things? Okay, cool. Okay, so then any last questions about hash functions and Merkle trees? Okay. So like you have, okay, I think I'll skip over like encryption, because we can just assume that people can encrypt stuff and then to keep things private. But like how these systems work, like a lot, like until you go into very like advanced, like very privacy focused things, which are where we all need to go, but the reality is that a lot of this technology is not quite there yet. It's not going to be applicable enough. But signature asymmetric signing is very interesting and relevant, I think, for like peer-to-peer technology. So for example, when I start my computer and I log dial-up to the internet, it used to be like the internet service provider, and still does, gives you an IP address, and then on the internet you're known as that IP address. But actually that IP address can change, It's not something, it can be taken away, you can lose it, you can change it, someone else could take it. So like that's not like, it's not a way you can authenticate. If you are, if you use eBay, then of course you can just send eBay your password and they have your password. And then they can check your password and they know it's you. But in an open public network, there's not one party that can check your password. So you can't just say, oh, I'm going to give this other node my password, because once they have it, they could basically impersonate myself, right? So if we would just use a simple password, that wouldn't work in a blockchain. And so what you do is you use signature schemes. Signature schemes signature algorithms basically work with a public key and a private key pair. So this is a key pair, private key. You have a pair, these two, that are tied together, and there's the following property. With my private key, I can take an arbitrary message and do a computation over it with that key, such that anyone can verify that I must have known this private key to verify the signature. So how it works in practice is I create this key pair. I tell you my private key is 1, my public key is something secret, and then later on you want to verify a signature of mine. For example, I say, hello, my name is Lucas, and you want to verify that I, the owner of this private key, have actually done that. You can use my public key that I've given you and verify that the signature I generate from the sentence, hello, my name is Lucas, together with the private key, you can verify that this message was really signed by someone that knows this private key. So that way, I can publicly create this statement, this signed message. Anyone can verify, but no one can actually create a signature without having this private key. So now, in many peer-to-peer protocols, actually with any website you visit, these signatures are used to authenticate who is communicating together. For example, when you request a website over SSL, the server sends you a signature proving that they have the private key to a given public key. And in the blockchain context, when I want to spend my coins, I basically create a signature with my private key, and then I can spend the coins that belong to this public key. So basically an Ethereum address or a Bitcoin UTXO, that's basically owned by a public, so like the blockchain knows, or the network knows, so this public key has 10 Ether, therefore for anyone to spend those 10 Ether, they would have to be able to sign a message that says, send 1 ETH to this other public key, and it would need to be verifiable with this public key. For example, in the P2P or IPFS, when you have encrypted connection, and when you look for a node on the network, you actually look for them by their public key, and then basically you can check that if I say I want to connect to Alice, and Alice's public key is this, I tell her, hey, sign this message, and she says, yes, here's my signature, and then I verify that it really is with this public key, then I know that it's actually not Eve that's giving me, saying I'm Alice, because Eve would not have been able to create this message that verifies with this public key. Presumably Eve doesn't have Alice's private key. If Alice loses a key, that's what makes life very hard for people in crypto, because if you lose these things, then of course you lose all of it, lose all of this the security that you get with cryptography. So that's I don't think it makes sense to go into how these signature schemes work in detail, because this, like, then we start talking about elliptic curves and like all sorts of math that is kind of would take a lot longer, and I probably wouldn't be the right person to actually explain that either. So, but does it more or less make sense how it works? Like what the private key is, what the public key is. You could sort of think of those as two chosen random numbers that have specific mathematical properties that allow you to calculate these signatures with the private key that then can be validated with the public key. Okay. So I've explained a little bit how, for example, in the blockchain model, this is used for identity or for spending coins. I think another interesting thing is if you need to establish an encrypted connection, you need to exchange an encryption key. But if you've never talked to each other before, and you just know, I want to talk to this person with public key A, then you cannot exchange this encryption key privately because you don't have any secure channel to communicate. And so this is like where like Diffie-Hellman key exchange comes in, which if we want to, we can walk through. But basically, that's a protocol. It's not really a primitive, or maybe by now it's considered a primitive. But it's a protocol that allows you to now take this signature scheme, sort of, and or take a protocol to exchange these private keys, and you can do so verifying that actually the person you're doing this protocol with to establish this shared secret that you now use for your encryption, that you do that in secret, that no one can spy on you. Threshold signatures would be a way that you can actually take, you can split the private key up. You can say, I have this message and I want to verify that at least 10 of these 20 people have signed. And I don't care which ones of these 10, I just care that at least 10 of these 20. For example, if you want to reach consensus on which version of the blockchain block is a valid one, you want to make sure that that a majority of people accepted this, a majority of the validators, but you actually don't want to have this overhead of verifying 20 different signatures or 10 different signatures, because that would be computationally expensive. And so threshold signatures are a way to basically create specific signatures that are valid if enough people sign it, and it doesn't matter which key signs it. Like you basically take you take this list of public keys, you calculate a threshold key from these different keys, and then you can verify with this threshold key to check that a certain number m of n. And so that's like super handy in this validator context. It's also something that's actually, I'm gonna add something here. It's if I, for example, have two computers, or if I have a phone and a computer, and I want to make sure that if someone gets control of my computer, that they can't spend all of my funds that I have in the wallet, I could use a threshold signature for this wallet instead of a regular signature, and I could say, I have this phone, I have another phone, I have my computer, and maybe on a USB drive, I have like these different keys, and if at least 2 confirm, or at least 3 confirm, then the blockchain should accept this as a transaction, and as a valid, as me, right? And so then I can do things where if I lose my computer, it's actually not bad, as long as I don't lose the m of n that are needed to sign, to create a valid signature, I'm safe. So like that's, threshold signatures have like, this is a super interesting property, and that sort of makes a lot of things more efficient.
So Lucas, is it the same as multisig?
So multisig is what in Ethereum is basically a program that implements this, but it's not a cryptographic primitive. A multisig essentially just stores all of the signatures and validates them one by one, and if it has at least these valid signatures, then it says, okay, execute this transaction. So usually that's a smart contract.
I see.
But it fulfills the same purpose, but it doesn't use a cryptographic primitive, it uses a smart contract for that. Whereas like Schnorr signatures in Bitcoin are, and that's actually super interesting, a patent expired in, I think 3 or 4 years ago, the Schnorr signature. Schnorr is the guy that invented it, most likely guy. That signature scheme was patented until very recently, so a few years ago. So no one used it in the open source software world because you couldn't use it. A lot of people you'd risk patent infringement if you used it. And so then a few 2 or 3 years ago, people got really excited about this because it was basically dead technology. They weren't really giving it an open source license. There wasn't a lot of application elsewhere outside of the blockchain and decentralized tech space. So actually this technology is pretty much dead because the industry didn't need it, and industry meaning like banks or things like that, or maybe they did and it was like very niche. But now Bitcoin actually very heavily, it was a very big exciting feature added to Bitcoin when that patent expired, because people started looking into it and said actually we can make our very simple Bitcoin smart contractless or very limited smart contract capability. We can still have these features like multi-sigs, right, with Schnorr. So I think that's where this is a very efficient and cheap way to verify and do a multi-sig much better, and theoretically also much safer than it, because the cryptography of this thing is rock solid, whereas code that implements a multi-sig can have issues, seen with the parity bug. So threshold signatures, just to give you guys so this was sort of locked up in a patent for a long time, or the most efficient implementation of it. There are other implementations of threshold signatures. They were just not very useful for what crypto wanted to do. There's also, I think, one interesting thing on threshold or similar to threshold signature. There are encryption schemes actually where you can have they're called blind signatures. So I can give you something to sign in a way that you cannot verify what it is that you signed, but you can still verify at a later point in time that this signature was that you made the signature even though you didn't know what you signed. And so this can be useful in for example, if I had to get something notarized by someone, I need to prove I did this action. They can sign my identity without me having to give them my information. They would sign saying, hey, yes, you did this, so I signed this, but then they wouldn't get all of my information, and at a later point could still verify what it is. So this is like a more obscure signature scheme. Yeah.
Sorry, no, I'm just wondering what would I don't know, what would be the utility of? I mean, you just made an example, but I'm not sure that
So for example, if you had the first cryptocurrency that existed, which was called Digi Cash many years ago, that actually didn't have a blockchain in the back end. It had a centralized issuing bank, and basically what this bank would give you a serial number or like a token that you could spend, but you have this problem that this bank could give you a serial number and then store, oh, actually I gave serial number 1 to Alice and serial number 2 to Bob, therefore when serial number 1 gets spent, I know, oh, Alice spent this, and so right, you give up this privacy. And so DigiCash actually solved this by saying, no, I go to bank and I tell them I want 5 tokens. Please sign these things, and then this bank, the issuer basically would sign. It would give Alice one signature and Bob one signature, but then at a later point in time, it can only verify that it actually issued these tokens but it can't verify if it was Alice's or Bob's that was spent. So that's like one application of blind signatures that in the blockchain world doesn't make sense anymore, but there are other places where it still does.
You're saying it's signed for everyone?
No,
but
so like you,
only issue tokens, like, and then issue tokens just.
so I give you a token with, so I tell you, give me a serial number and I will sign it, and then you have one token you can spend. And I know, yes, I've signed a serial number, but I don't know which serial number I signed. And then I can't track you anymore because I don't know. I know I signed something of you once, but then when you later use that token, I can't relate that to the time I made the signature. It could be any of those other 1,000 tokens that I've signed. I just know that I've signed 1,000 different tokens. So we can go into, let's see, time. So going through, I think I like to like show Shanwei secret sharing. Just
I was gonna ask you about it.
yeah. So how do you know about secret sharing? Some people reacted when I mentioned that.
I think because people in Scotland was trying to.
Dark crystal.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
How do you share your secrets? Yeah.
Okay. So I don't want to go too much into the math, but basically, you have a polynomial. Actually, this is wrong. You have a graph, and you have like a polynomial. So this is like some formula of the form a times x squared plus b times, or a times x plus b times x squared, or x squared plus c times x cubed. Right, so it's like gives you this curve, and so basically the rule is that so this is a 3-degree polynomial because it has x squared and x cubed, 3 degrees. The curve of a 3-degree polynomial. So a 1-degree polynomial generally looks like this, right? X squared. This is x squared. Then you have, if you have x, you have this, then it will look something like this. And so the math says, or basically you know that if you have 2 points, two points on this curve, and I tell you that this is a 1-degree polynomial, like this is x, basically this is, so you have a times x squared. If I give you any 2 points, and you know that this curve is of form a times x squared, then you can actually calculate what a is based on this point and this point, right? So point 1 and point b, like you have p is x and y, and p1 and p2 is another x1 and y1, and this is x2 and y2. So Xiaomi secret sharing is quite an ingenious idea. That basically what you want to do is you want to share a secret, and you want to make sure that only if enough people come together that they can recover what the secret is. And so essentially what you do is you say the secret is A, and I'm going to give Alice this point and Bob this point. So without both of them talking about what their points are, what these points are, they won't know what this function is, therefore they won't know what A is. They don't know what the curve looks like. It could look like this, or it could look like this, right? It could look like this. So like that's kind of the, until they have, if they have, actually, sorry, this is not, they don't go all through, like, if they have 1 point here and 1 point here, like it could be like this, or it could be like this, and they don't know. Only when they get this extra point can they recover what the curve formula is. So secret sharing basically, and so when you have so for every degree that you add, so if you add x to the power 4, and then you will need an additional point. So basically what you do is you encode your secret in this very long polynomial, and then you have different points that you can share, and that's how Xiangmi secret sharing works. It works over like, there's certain like, it's slightly more complicated because it uses prime numbers and modulo and it's a bit more complicated like than that, but essentially this is the core method of how secret sharing works, which I think is like super simple, but like allows you to do very powerful things.
So every degree you add, that means that another person needs to be, or does that not correlate together?
Every degree, requires you to provide another point, which means
Another person? Or,
well,
or like a,
I can also use a 5-degree curve and give 2 points to you and 3 points to you.
okay.
So that would be basically your 3 points plus your 2, and I give another, or like 1 point to you, and like then you can pick points that you can give the same points to different people, or there's like a little bit more to it than that, but you can basically create M of n. So like you give many different points to different people, but if enough people come together, then they can find out what the exact curve is and recover the secret. But yeah.
Can you speak to the example on Scuttlebutt then?
Yeah, so the example on Scuttlebutt is, on Scuttlebutt, right, you don't have a username in the server that you log in, but you have a public and private key that you use, right? So again, like if I post something as Lucas, I post something with this key, and the only thing that Scuttlebutt, the protocol, cares about what key is posted. Actually on Scuttlebutt, you see it if it's someone you don't know, it just shows you this base 64 encoded public key, and then this basically every update I do in Scuttlebutt, I sign with my private key, and then your Scuttlebutt client would show that yes, this message was verified by this public key, so it's from this public key. And then you can give my public key a nickname, and then like it becomes Lucas. But basically now the problem is if you lose that key, then you can never post that person again. And so the secret sharing, this project is called Dark Crystal, was basically applying the secret sharing to the private key that you use on Scuttlebutt. So I could, for example, say, look, you guys are all my friends. If I lose my computer, like, and I personally come to you and chat with you and tell you, hey, like, it's me, like, you should like give me your share of the secret, then I collect all of these different shares, and as long as M of n people are giving me this share, then I can recover my own private key. And the idea is basically that probably not a majority of my friends will betray me and sell this secret to someone else. So as long as the majority are honest and really only giving the secret to me, and if I use some offline communication, meaning not on Scuttlebutt of course, but like I send you an email because you have my email address, or I see you on the street somewhere, right? Then we can coordinate and basically me personally recovering the public and the private key that I used. And so that was secret sharing in Scuttlebutt. But it can be done for different things, right? If you just need to distribute information and you need to make sure that only if everyone, or only if a certain threshold of people cooperate, then this information can be retrieved. So for example, I could have it's like if I have some secret information that I want to be released if I die, then I don't want to trust a single person. I don't give them the information. I encrypt it and I give the encryption key. I use secret sharing to give the encryption key to many different people and tell them, look, if you guys read that I died, then you should release this information, right? So like this dead man switch, you could implement that way. So those kind of things where you don't want to trust a single entity with everything, like secret sharing is quite nice. Threshold signatures are also for these kind of things, right? Like if you just want to verify, if we have 5 different weather stations and we want to agree that if you believe that it rains in Berlin, or if we say that if it rained in Berlin yesterday, then I have to give you $100. We say we use a threshold signature that if 3 of those 5 weather stations say it rained yesterday and they sign this message, then that it rained, then the signature is valid, and the smart contract can look at that signature and say, oh great, okay, I like pay out the bounty. So this is like similar, yeah. Which like I think unless there is other questions or topics, we can go like quickly into zero knowledge proofs, which is going to be a challenge. I think, and if everyone's still awake, I would say, like, so in how much detail did they come up in the past? None.
That they exist.
So does anyone know of a paper example?
I looked one up.
Yeah.
So it's basically like,
Where's Waldo or?
no, it's like you're in a cave.
Oh, okay. So I
So
think
it's-
I like the Where's Waldo
Okay,
example
you learn
better.
all the time.
I think it's the cave one is good, but it's okay. So I'll use the Waldo example. I think it works a little bit better. Okay, so we have okay, so we have is everyone familiar with Where's Waldo? Not everyone, so it's an American thing, but so Where's Waldo is this crazy busy image where there's like a guy with a black and
He's got like a red and white scarf,
yeah, red and white
And then
scarf.
like it's this picture and there's a million things happening in the picture and
And you
everything's like
can-
Oh,
tiny.
okay, yes,
Yeah,
So,
yes,
so
yes,
like
yes.
I have to find the one
our
that-
Where's Waldo is very simple. I just put a point here, right? So this is Waldo, and now I actually, and in my Where's Waldo example, so I need to prove to you that I know where Waldo is, right? But I don't want to tell you where he is. Like if I just say, hey, here's Waldo, then you know it too. So I want to prove to you without revealing the answer that I know where Waldo is. And so if I have this large sheet of paper with a hole in it, and I have this thing here, then and I basically say, okay, like I'm gonna do something under the table that you can't look at, and I align this small sheet of paper behind the large sheet of paper such that you can see it. You don't know where Waldo is, right? Because you just know that I know it because you see this part. You don't know if the small sheet of paper is up here or down there or turned around, right? And so this is like basically a zero knowledge proof. Like I've proven to you that I know where Waldo is, but you can't tell me where it is, right? Like if I give you this now, you wouldn't know where. Like now you know, but so that's like a zero knowledge proof on paper. And so when you apply that to computers, it becomes a lot more complicated because basically then what you say is I have some sort of computation that I want to verify, that I want someone to be verified to be able to verify without them being able to know what the computation was. For example, one thing that I would like what's a simple example we could use for a zero knowledge proof right now? If we have like so this one example that we actually implemented at Centrifuge. So we have a credit rating agency. This credit rating agency every day publishes a table of public key and rating. Right, so you have like Alice, Bob, Charlie, or public keys, A, B, C, and D. And you have like, this is a rating 5, this is a 5, this is a 10, and this is a 1. And now, actually I want to say, I'm Alice, or basically I want to have this zero knowledge proof that says I have a credit rating 5, but I don't want to tell you who of this list I am. And so I can't sign a message that says I'm A, because then you would know I'm A. So what you do is I signed that message, but instead of giving it a signature, we create a zero knowledge proof that proves that I signed this message with a key that in this list has a rating of 5. But I don't give you the public key that I used to sign it. I don't give you the signature. All that this zero knowledge proof has, like if you think of it, it's this black box where I put in. And so by the way, so when we did this example, what we did is we created a Merkle tree out of this. So we created a Merkle tree out of this, and so we have like the root, right? And this is public, so like my credit rating is public. So we pass in this root, so that everyone that verifies the zero knowledge proof knows as a public input, a public parameter that can be verified by everyone. So if this is root, and there's this public output that says the rating, but then there's this like secret information that is the signature, and you have some sort of message, whatever. It basically says it's the message I need to sign. There's a signature, and then there's this other property, which is the Merkle proof for the key. So now so you can think of this as a program, though they function very differently than traditional programs. Basically what this program does is it verifies this Merkle proof. So in here, I'm Alice. I would give this proof that proves that this rating and this public key are one of the leaves in this tree. So therefore, like basically, by verifying this proof, I can say, okay, this is 5, and this is this public output, and I verify that actually this public output corresponds to a rating in this tree. And I also give you the signature, so that basically for 5 and A, right, which gives me this Merkle proof. This Merkle proof proves that for this root, this is complex, I'm sorry. So this Merkle root proves that I know this public root, I know that in this root, A has a credit rating of 5, so I can verify this Merkle proof in secret without revealing, so right, this is the secret part. And I verify that, of course, I could give any key here, any public key, and without checking the signature, like for this message, I wouldn't know if I really know the private key to this A. So I also need to check that the signature here that I pass in for this message basically is valid for this key. And so now what we have is we have a root for these ratings. So we know that this is something we all agreed upon before. We have the message that basically challenges me to create a valid signature for something I pick in here. And this Merkle proof makes sure that actually the signature that is validated, it was actually in this tree. And so I privately compute this thing, which gives me then like some proof that with a verification program, anyone can check that anyone can see that this root and this message was used and this rating was the result, but they don't have any information about what was happened. And so here I gain privacy because basically the same proof with the rating 5 and this root could mean it's either done by A or B, right? Because both have a rating of 5. So if I would give a difference, if I would give Bob's signature and Bob's Merkle proof, the output would be 5, but we don't know if it was A or B.
Is the proof a function? Like what
yeah,
does the proof
it's
look like in this case?
Yeah, so not on a computer science definition of function, it's not, because it's not really a sequential thing. It's more of a set of rules that all need to be met, but that can sort of be modeled as a function. Like it's not chronologically executed like a computer program where you have a function, but basically, yeah, it's all of this rule. It's this rule that the signature must be valid. It's this rule that like the Merkle proof needs to be something in here. So this is, yeah, it's like a program, and there's a programming language that you use to create this constraint system, which is like the function, the method.
And so if I'm the person that says like, I want to prove to you that I have this rating of 5 without
Mhm.
sharing my public key, and the program or the service I'm using in order to validate that I actually have that rating of 5, they, the service provider, uses this proof, and what do they have to input into the proof?
So basically what you do is you create this program, like this box or whatever, and that in the language that you create, this gives you two programs. It gives you the verifier, and basically that is used where if you pass in this proof, it says true or false.
Okay.
And so this would, so for anyone to validate your proof, they have to use this verifier program. And for you to create the proof, this box, there's basically this proving program that you can derive from this like set of rules. And then you have to use a proving program to create this proof. And so the prover, that's where the private stuff happens, where you pass in the private information. The proof contains the public information, and then the verify plus some numbers that you use to check. And then basically with those numbers and the public inputs, this verifier can know, okay, this is, like you're only able to find, like this gives you like elliptic curve points. So it gives you like just basically a set of numbers. Like I think, depending on what implementation, you can imagine like it gives you 5 numbers, and this verifier does it does an operation on these numbers. Like it checks, are those numbers structured the right way, and basically, again, it's a thing of probability, but basically it's extremely hard to find these numbers unless you know a correct solution for this puzzle. And so all I need to do is I don't verify that this computation happened because I don't know anything about it, but I know that if you do this computation in this way and you have numbers that validate, then the only way you get to those numbers that validate is if you have the right input. Because otherwise it's a one-way function in that you cannot easily find numbers that satisfy all these requirements unless you have a valid input.
And the proof is a secret thing, of course, right? It's secret, the proof.
The proof itself is not secret because it doesn't reveal anything anymore. But you create this proof with your private input, but then it has these numbers that don't reveal anything about the input, right? So like the proof is basically me showing you this, and how I make the proof is how I align the paper, and basically these numbers, or like instead of having this big sheet of paper, this verifier asks for a set of numbers, and I can only calculate these numbers if I know the input to the puzzle. So like if I can create a valid signature, I can calculate what these numbers are, and then you can verify the numbers without having to verify the signature.
But what if I have somebody else steals my proof? They can.
So here maybe like super simple, but not I don't know if it's even a primitive, but basically that's something we have. Oh, you mean the rainbow table? When you said rock, paper, scissors. Yeah. So one thing that you frequently do in cryptography is you have a challenge or a so for example here I would say, prove to me in this proof I actually want you to sign message X, and you then need to go and create the valid signature for X, and then I tell you sign message X, and I tell you sign message Y, and I tell you sign message C, and then I know that actually X was already used once from you, so if you would give me this proof, then I would say no, actually I asked you to sign Y, and that's how I would generate this, make sure they can't be reused. which actually maybe this is an interesting topic. So when you, of course, a hash or a signature, like you could reuse it, right? So what is frequently done, for example, in Ethereum, so that I can't just take this signature and say this is a valid transaction. There's something that says every time I create a new transaction, we all increase a counter and say, oh, you've used the transaction 5. So the next time you always append, and so this is then is called nonce. This is like a challenge, but the nonce is just a simple number, right? And like the first transaction has 1, and then you do +1, and then so you get to 2, and basically every time I spend coins in Ethereum, my nonce needs to be increased. And so because otherwise, of course, like I spend coins once, everyone would be able to just submit the same transaction again. And to make sure that that doesn't happen, basically I need to have unique nonces. Or here would have been like this message, right, where I tell you sign this message.
And the next person, I give a new message,
Yeah.
and then they won't be able to use it.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so the nonce achieves the same thing. Yeah. Cool.
I have a couple of questions.
Yeah.
The first is for the verifier, like, is there kind of an accepted minimum number of points that you wanna have?
Yeah, so it depends on the proving scheme. There are many different ones, and there are like new ones every couple of months. This is like extremely, so like all of the cryptography we talked about is probably 20 years old, except for zero knowledge proofs themselves are also 20 years old, but the technology that made them computationally feasible and usable in our world today, like some of this stuff is, I mean, like when Zcash were the first ones that really used it, and like they released I think 2 years ago. So this is like, compared to everything else, this is like bleeding edge cryptography, which means that it changes a lot, but and it's uncertain how secure this stuff is compared to other stuff that we know with a relatively high confidence it is. But so there are different styles of verifying, and usually they have there are also different zero knowledge proofs. Some zero knowledge proofs have a constant proof size. So that means no matter how complicated your program, it might get harder to create the proof because it's hard computationally, but like this proof is constant size. And this is actually a very cool property where it's not even about privacy, but then you have a very small proof for an arbitrary large computation. And so then actually you can use this as a performance thing, right? So you want to scale, you have this constant proof size. Other proving systems have a, for example, a linear proof size. So depending on how complex this is, linearly it grows, the complexity grows of the proof. Some are logarithmic, so like then it doesn't grow as fast. But basically, so there are these different things. There's also generally, sometimes some of these proof systems require all of us to do a setup before. So if you wanted to create one, if we wanted to verify this proof, we would need to agree on this verifier and exchange create this shared secret that Zcash, you can read about like the Senate ceremony or the multi-party computation, where basically you need to have like some sort of randomness that you need to pick together that will like serve as input to this program to make it harder, because if you could pick that randomness, then you could basically come up with solutions. So like so this is like trusted setups, right, is what this is called. So some zero knowledge proofs have a need for a trusted setup, others don't. Like they're like it's a whole like there's so many different ones, like it's hard to talk. I mean, bulletproofs, Starks, zero knowledge, ZK snarks, like those are like the main categories. There are range proofs that do like a subset of computations very well, and then others can do any arbitrary computation. So it's it really, you need to be like very specific about the use case and where you're doing them, how you're doing it, to really be able to say this proof or that proof system.
My second question was the program that finds the rules for the proof. How does that work?
The program that finds the rules for the proof. You mean like, for example, I say I want to verify the signature?
So you said there were two, like you said there's two programs. There's one that's like the verifier that just checks
And the prover.
true or false, and it's the proof. Yeah. And then there's the proving rules program.
The prover, so you create your zero knowledge proof that has these rules, and with that you can execute the proving program that will create a proof that will try to find a proof for these rules with your input, and then there's a verifier, and the prover you run with your private data, and the verifier anyone else runs that wants to verify your proof.
But the prover, how do you generate the prover?
So
Do you have to come up with it, or does it like?
So like there are these zero knowledge programming languages that basically you create your program, and the way you would compile a normal program and get some code that a computer can execute, you get some code that this prover can use to create the proof. That's typically how it's done. In like you can go down into the math and like look at how this actually works, and you could do all this by hand, but most people that do this stuff, and there are not that many that do it. I think there may be like 200 people in this world that actually do stuff with zero knowledge proofs. Though like most people use programming languages for that are specifically made for zero knowledge proofs.
I heard it's very expensive. Is it?
Yeah, I mean, it's. Yeah, it is. So I mean, just in general with like peer-to-peer tech, like I think the downsides, like the benefits far outweigh the downsides. But of course, I mean, all of this stuff we've talked about today, right? Like if you just have an eBay in the middle that both people trust, it's a lot easier to do than like having to use a signature scheme to like come up with an identity, because like that's like right. So I think that is one thing, and I think why like cryptography is so it's like very crucial to peer-to-peer tech, is because we cannot rely on anything, and we always have to use this like very complicated like math problems basically to like ensure that no one can fake certain things. And so zero knowledge proofs are very expensive. They've become a lot cheaper on Ethereum recently, and I think they were almost a bit too expensive because they were so exotic in the beginning, and now people are actually making huge amounts of progress on optimizing them so that it gets a lot better. I mean, and really like in 2016 a paper was released that made it I think 30% cheaper to do this verification, for example, right? And so like 2016 is, as I said, like I mean, Diffie-Hellman was 80s or 90s, I think 90s, but early 90s. Like threshold signatures, that's at least 20 years old. Like all of this stuff, right? Like those papers of but not just the first idea of how to do it, but like of the actual math that we're using today. A lot of this stuff is a few decades old, and like for example, this new proving scheme is a few years old. I think that's the. So yeah, the question about how expensive it is, it's unfortunate, it's very expensive, very complicated to build, but I hope I've shown you a little bit that it's not that complicated. You have to be careful not to pick like the wrong primitives and like forget about things, and there's like so many more attacks, but if you start looking at those things as building blocks, then you can start like building blind auctions and commitment schemes, and there's other places you'll find a need for that, and like somewhere you want to use signatures, things like that. Actually it becomes feasible to do without having a PhD in cryptography.
So like everybody working on these and strongly motivated to start to optimize them, are you seeing any kind of like trend in terms of how expensive or inexpensive? Like does it look like it's gonna, does it look like it's like falling precipitously? Like 30% seems like a huge.
Yeah, but I mean, so for example, like Zcash, it used to take 45 seconds to create a proof. So that's not on the blockchain to verify, but to create the proof. And that's because they use like a signature scheme that was not as efficient, a hash function that was not as efficient. They used SHA-256 instead of Pedersen. In the new release that they released this summer, I think, they changed a lot of these primitives that they used that they had to verify in this. And because those programs behave extremely weirdly compared to how we are used to programming computers, because of that, like that actually was a 10-fold speed up. So now, like instead of 45 seconds, it takes 4 seconds to create a proof, and it could go down even more. And they did that in like 2 years of like the first version went live 2 years before the second version went live. And so I think there's a few more like order of magnitude level increase in speed up and like just of how like especially zero knowledge proofs will change. So probably it'll like this is like just to keep up with the papers that are being published on this is like not as a full-time job. So yeah.
Because they all have like their own kind of, the primitives all have kind of like their own
They just like they combine new things and come up with like small optimizations or like sometimes completely new approaches. There's a whole competition running right now by the National Institute of Standards in the US, the NIST competition on post-quantum secure hash functions. So like there's I think a $500,000 or more prize on like the best, most secure quantum secure hash function, and their like signature schemes being developed. But like if you look at them, they're like 1,000 times worse, 1,000 times as slow. Like the key size, like for example, in some of these signature schemes, like a signature scheme, if it's quantum secure but your key is 4 megabytes, imagine like 1 million Ethereum users, and you have 4 megabytes for each key that you need to store to verify their signatures. Well, like this like blows up your hard drive, right? So like you can't even if it theoretically is working and quantum secure, like they're not really useful for our use case right now. So like things like that, right, where like quantum secure constructions are like still very early and changing a lot. Zero knowledge is things like that. I think the rest of this is mostly, it's not changing as quickly anymore. Although like the hash function, it's going to be used in Ethereum 3, Blake2P, it's also used by Zcash. It's very expensive right now in Ethereum because it's not available as a primitive natively. It's significantly faster on computers. But the problem is then like sometimes you don't run your hash function on computers. Sometimes there's a dedicated chip that runs the hash function. There are now chips as well for Blake2P, but if you have a low power device, like a ledger, for example, a hardware wallet, that hardware wallet actually has a chip that needs to then support it, and it's not a beefy CPU that can do all of this. So then maybe actually some primitives are not available on this hardware, but your smartwatch needs to be able to do it efficiently, or like so there's like all of these considerations.
So it's
But
like
yeah.
about 8:45,
Yeah.
but are you still lingering for like 5-10 more
Yeah.
minutes? Cool. Then if you still have a couple questions for Lucas, you can ask them, but I want to give people the chance to go if they need to go. Thank you so much, Lucas.
Yeah.
This was great.